Thank you very much. I'd like to now turn it over to the audience to ask questions that you might have. Yeah.
Dr. Bob Arnott here. I'm a consultant with Monster Energy. So, Dr. Goldberg, I just had two very quick questions. First of all, you indicated sudden death, of course, is what we're all most concerned about, and also indicated that you need a very large sample size. So you have 50 billion energy drinks sold worldwide, 20 billion sold in the U.S., and yet you don't see any clusters. You'd expect to see clusters on college campuses, or you'd expect to see clusters at concerts and whatnot. Why aren't you seeing that? And secondly, Dr. Higgins had indicated that with an increase in stroke volume was more work for the heart. My understanding is if an increase in stroke volume for the same amount of work, you'd actually have a decrease in afterload doing volume work, and actually would be less workload on the heart and more beneficial.
So I agree with your observation about the large exposures, and that's why I think if there is a risk, it's likely very small. And I would say the same thing with coffee. I mean, I think even though the data shows that there's really no detectable increased risk, we're only 95% sure that it's not some small increment in risk. And I think you could say the same thing with the energy drinks, that there's huge exposure. You don't have widespread data collection on every case of exposure and whether there was or there wasn't. But you do have population health, and there does not appear to be a large signal. That doesn't rule out a very, very small effect, the same size as caffeine in coffee. And there you do have some data, and you do have an idea of what the confidence intervals are. And I'll let Dr. Higgins address the question about the stroke volume.
Actually, myocardial oxygen consumption is directly proportional to the myocardial work, which is the stroke volume and heart rate, and the afterload of blood pressure. And all three were increased in the Red Bull group. So they actually were doing more work for the same amount of exercise.
And so when you look at the pressure product there, are you saying that with an increased stroke volume, you're not doing more volume work and less pressure work?
They're doing more total work.
And so where's the work going to? In other words, if you have more cardiac output, where is that cardiac output?
Well, nowhere. It's like flogging a dead horse. You don't need it to do the exercise. The other guys were able to do the exercise, the same amount of exercise with a lower heart rate, a lower stroke volume. So it appears to be giving an excessive stimulation more than what's actually required.
But again, I use these in competition. So would it not be an advantage, though, to be able to have more stroke volume in, like time trial or a very competitive race?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I think we would need to do some more studies on that.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question about that. You said the difference was taurine or not taurine. Taurine enhances the function of the mitochondria. So that means it's enhancing the function of the respiratory chain. The heart, when you're in exercise, is going to be somewhat hypoxic. Okay, so if you can use that oxygen in a better way to produce more ATP, the heart is going to benefit, and you're going to have an enhanced contraction.
Again, I cannot comment because I do not believe they measure that actual effect you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at stroke volume is not enough. I mean, there's a lot of things that can affect contraction, afterload and preload and everything. So,
right, the total cardiac work, the total cardiac work that was done for the same level of exercise was higher. That's what the study showed.
I'd like to reiterate the fact that 50 billion sold is really, when you're talking about your sample size of 9 people exercising, if I were maybe Julius Caesar's taste tester and the first can of energy drink came out and I heard you guys talk, I'd be a little fearful. But if one person drank one a second, that would be 1,500 years of people drinking one energy drink a second. There are 350,000 sudden deaths a year. I have seen cases, Dr. Higgins, of people who have had coronary spasm throughout my entire career. And I guarantee some of them had milk before that happened, and some of them probably had ginger ale, probably some of them had yogurt, and one day someone's going to have an energy drink. Coronary spasm is not a new disease. It is one that is frequently seen when you look at the population at large. I'm concerned about trying to match the magnitude of a phenomenon as large as the number sold against minor anecdotes and bench research that is not related to what's happening in the clinical arena. You don't need, and again, if you have 350,000 sudden deaths, you can find somebody who had an energy drink that day. That is not a way to do science. And by the way, I tried one yesterday. I had a Monster, just like your Ken. I chose to recycle it instead of carrying it in an evidence bag, but that's your choice. But the point is that I don't understand what's going on here. There's no disease. I'm a clinician, and I know other clinicians. We are not seeing a disease. We're seeing 50 billion people in the world consuming this. 50 billion, that's the largest study I've ever heard of. And I agree, there would have to be clusters. You'd have to see sorority and fraternity parties having people carted out. But one day someone is going to die. There'll be one every minute in the United States for this year, and one of them has to have an energy drink.
Okay.
Was there a question associated with that, or was that just a comment?
My question
And
is,
sorry, who
okay, here's
could
the
you
question then.
could you repeat
Do you
your name and
believe
who
that your
you?
study of 9 people really matters?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
I think. I mean, there are seven individuals who have died so far. I mean, if it was your daughter or teenage son, would that be important to you, sir?
We better move on.
Can I make a very quick comment, please? Because the topic at hand is not energy drinks. It's about caffeine and food and dietary supplements. And I would make the plea that I think we do the entire field and everyone in this room a disservice if we put everything in the pool and treat it the same. What we have to talk about is what is the composition of the food or the composition of the beverage that we're studying that gets associated with any case. Otherwise, it'd be like saying milk does something. We pay no attention if it's whole milk, 1%, 2%. That's the antithesis of good science and good nutrition research.
Okay.
Lisa Lefferts, I'm a senior scientist with Center for Science in the Public Interest. No one's talked yet about sugar and caffeine. And we heard yesterday, I think it was from Dr. Temple, about the reinforcing properties of caffeine. And we know that there's a natural reward system with sugar. And I wondered if anybody on the panel or any of the speakers yesterday could talk about that. I recall the research being discussed that the more, I think that particularly the young males drank, the more caffeine, the more they liked the soda. So I just thought this interaction between caffeine and sugar could be potentially very important. Could anyone address that?
I can just briefly comment that the sugar contents do vary in the different concoctions. So, for example, the sports drinks, they typically have about 6 to 8% carbohydrate concentration, which appears to be about optimal for absorption during exercises, whereas the energy drinks are close to about 11 to 12%. So that could affect slowing of the gastric emptying. But interestingly, one study showed that the ergogenic benefits of caffeine, that is, how caffeine can kind of help your muscles to contract and exercise, appeared to be reduced when combined with carbohydrates during exercise. However, it may have an improvement in longer duration exercise, but they were the only things that I was able to find. And also one last study which suggested that caffeine absorption into the circulation may be slowed when it is consumed with a lot of glucose. In this study, 75 grams, and or it may accelerate its removal from the circulation when combined with glucose. So there does seem to be potentially some interaction with caffeine and glucose.
I'm thinking more about being very concerned about the epidemic of obesity and problems with diabetes and their link with consumption of sugary beverages and sugary foods. And that's my concern, that caffeine could be reinforcing the natural reward system of sugar. And it's that larger issue that I was wanting to address.
Thank you. Now, that's been raised in the literature.
I'm Michael Jacobson, also from the Center for Science in the Public Interest. And I'm not sure it's a question that a panelist can answer, but we heard a little bit about concentrations, I think of taurine in energy drinks, but not of the concentrations of ginkgo or ginseng or some of the other ingredients. And I've wondered, first, when you're designing experiments, it's clearly important to know what the concentration is of these ingredients. I've wondered if things like taurine are added primarily as a way to get the word on the label and make people think there's something special about the product. And maybe there are just homeopathic amounts of ginseng or ginkgo, some of those other ingredients. And I've wondered, are there effects on the taste of the food or something, or biological, physiological effects from the incremental amounts of these ingredients beyond what one might consume? And none of you is a lawyer, I believe, but a question for the FDA is it legal to even add these ingredients? Are they added for drug-like effects or traditional food additive effects? Because if they're added for drug-like effects, it seems to me that these products are drugs, not foods. Any comments on that?
Well,
Especially the
I can
concentrations.
tell you a little bit about ginseng, for example. There's different extracts of ginseng, and that gives you different types of there's a lot of steroids, and you can get different, depending upon how you extract, you get a different mix of steroids. The one study that I showed you on seizures, they added 20 milligrams per kilogram of the extract. I don't know how that relates to the energy drink. I mean, in terms of concentration, it'd be in a comparable range, but I don't know what extract is used in energy drinks.
Do we know how much of the ginseng is added to energy drinks?
Yeah, that was.
Yeah, I think it, let's see, Monster has 400 milligrams of ginseng extract, and Rockstar 50 milligrams.
So 400 milligrams, and then you're adding in that one study 20 milligrams per kilogram. That's well in the range. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Steve Lipschultz, Miami. In light of Dr. Goldberger and Dr. Keene's comments that this is a session related to caffeine and other substances and looking at future directions and needs, and you bring up sudden cardiac death, and Dr. Arnott and others just brought up comments on this. Again, I just want to reiterate, I asked this question yesterday to Dr. Goldberger, and I want to see if today there's similar thoughts. I mean, my impression was there has not been any real registry looking at these effects. There's inferential secondary analyses, and some of these really, when I asked the question yesterday, did any of these studies involve multiple components in the form of energy drinks? Your answer to me was no. When I asked did it involve certain vulnerable populations, I'm here to comment in the next session on children. I said I didn't think it did. You confirmed that that was the case. When I asked, were you only focused on known bona fide predictors of sudden cardiac death, because isolated VPBs, no matter how infrequent or frequent, are not usually in the cardiology community considered strong predictors of sudden cardiac death. You didn't disagree. And so I guess emotion comes up in these debates in the absence sometimes of data. And so if you're really looking at future directions, shouldn't the recommendation be, if we think, as you said, sudden cardiac death is an important outcome, that this be part of one of the things that's recommended to be tracked in a post-marketing surveillance type situation so that you can let data, not emotion, guide policy?
So those are excellent comments. I think that when we do, for example, non-inferiority trials, comparing a new product to an available product, one of the things that you always have to decide a priori is what your non-inferiority margin is. How much worse can, I thought maybe you had better comments. So you have to decide what your non-inferiority margin, how much worse the new product could be compared to the old product. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the largest collection of data is related to coffee consumption in adult populations. Are the data consistent with, you know, 0.1% increased risk in sudden cardiac death related to coffee consumption? Sure, that probably falls within the 95% confidence intervals. Could that be also observed in vulnerable populations? Sure, there's no data. Could it also be observed related to other forms of caffeine? Absolutely. And you know, I think that that's a reasonable, it's a reasonable thing to track these things and to keep observing and to get the information and then decide whether whether these formulations are different. There's no reason a priori that, I mean, caffeine is clearly the most cardioactive or one of the most cardioactive compound in all of these compounds, and there's no reason to necessarily believe that that is or isn't the only factor that may be associated with outcomes.
Hi, my name's Tom Davis, professor of pharmacology and physiology, Arizona, plus I'm the chief scientific officer of Monster. My question is actually related to Dr. Schaefer's work and how it was commented on actually by Dr. Higgins. And I found it rather interesting that what Dr. Schaefer, weren't you talking about work on blood pressure and heart rate measurements? Not really done in a test tube, okay? So I think that's an important point. I'm pretty sure you can't get a heart rate from a test tube or a blood pressure. That's number one. Number two is, it's often, and this is for the whole panel, we tend to cherry pick some references that we wish to make a point. That can be really dangerous, and I think we should probably stop doing that. It doesn't help this field. And I think what Dr. Keene said in terms of looking at the food and looking at coffee and looking at other areas is a very important point. And rather than focus on demonizing a certain group of products, whatever they are, I mean, my company since 1936, when my uncle founded it, has put out juices and natural sodas my entire, you know, let's see, I'm 63, so that's 53 years of my life. And we don't appear to focus on any given area. We just talk about the food and the science-based aspect of that. So I think it's very important that we don't generalize too much and simplify a lot of preclinical animal data that is the basis for the FDA process for drug development as well. And having developed a drug that's in phase 2 clinical trials in neuroprotectant and stroke right now, I assure you, without the preclinical data presented by you, Doctor, today, on these animal work, we wouldn't have never got to a drug for phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. And don't forget, phase 1 is a safety study. It can only be done after the preclinical animal studies. So let's not stick it all in a test tube yet. We still have a lot of good animal work to do and a lot of good foods to look at. Thank you.
I agree with Dr. Davis, and I think that we do need to do more research. And I'd just like to clarify, my comments were regarding when you just take two compounds, for example, if you're having caffeine and taurine and then exposing it, and whether you're doing the measurements, in some of the cases they were in vitro, and then some of them they were done with in vivo, that is maybe a different result to when you actually have those substances which are found, there are 3, 4, 5 substances. There may be other interactions that you have not accounted for and may result in a different effect.
Just also want to expand on that as well, related to sudden cardiac death. Sudden cardiac death is really a very complex condition. It's got multiple factors that it's multidimensional. There's usually not even one factor that can explain sudden cardiac death. Even if you take a young person with long QT syndrome, which is a known risk factor for sudden cardiac death, that person is living with long QT syndrome for years and years of their life, and sudden cardiac death appears out of nowhere at one instant. So there have to be a lot of factors really that come together at one particular time to create that environment. So this is not sudden cardiac death and exposure to caffeine and caffeine-related products. It's not like a peanut allergy where somebody takes a peanut and all of a sudden they blossom into an allergy, fatal or otherwise. Sudden cardiac death, and even theoretically, if this were related to ingestion of caffeine, it's probably occurring. It would probably have been in people who have been ingesting caffeine for years. So I think it's a very complex problem, and I don't think it can be very easily ferreted out. But that's got to be part of the analysis and consideration.
Dr. Schaefer, for moderating this and for the excellent overview that you gave, and thanks to all the members of the panel. I'm now moving us forward because our next presentation is on WebEx, and we have somebody standing by. James Coughlin, going to invite you to get us kicked off for it.